we're going to switch a little bit, but
Okay.
but this is somewhat related. So your organization has been critical of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Now, I want you to kind of walk us through it, because originally it was sort of seen as, oh, this is really helpful, and they do a lot of the work to do the research on legislation, and it's former lawmakers who get employed there and help things out. But what's the criticism?
Well, I think this is a huge problem, because essentially what you have going on is legislators are outsourcing their responsibilities to corporate lobbyists, who are essentially drafting model pieces of legislation, and then legislators take those model pieces of legislation and bring them home and introduce it without knowing the full impact of the law.
That doesn't sound good.
And that is a huge problem. I mean, just this week we found an example in the state of Florida where you had a legislator who basically took this cookie cutter bill,
Word for word. Yeah.
word for word, and in there had the ALEC mission statement. And so she has this statement of this
Forgot to hit the
organization
delete
and
button.
forgot to take it out. And I mean, essentially, this is
I think we've all
plagiarism
been
here.
there where we forgot to hit the
Oops.
And so what this group does is, I mean, they've tried to sort of pitch this as, oh, it's not that a problem. But again, you have corporate lobbyists writing these pieces of legislation, and it has a direct impact on individuals. So you have a bill that's actually going to show up next week. Basically, what it's doing is it's creating
in this state.
In this state. So we released a report about 2 weeks ago now that found over 60 pieces of legislation, model bills from ALEC that have been introduced in the state of Minnesota.
So what's going to show up next week?
So what's going to show up next week is a bill dealing with what's called asbestos, basically liability. And so what they're trying to do is they've crafted a law that limits the liability of an asbestos manufacturer. So this is a very harmful product that was produced in the 50s and 60s. People have gotten sick as a result of it. Many people have died. And what they're trying to do is limit the liability for this corporation and say, if basically they can't be sued as a result of this. And so it's these type of things where you have victims coming forward and they now have fewer rights as a result of these bills. You also have a lot of tort issues coming forward where they're
We
limiting
just
the
heard
amount of
tort
time.
reform up here. At the,
Yes, and all those bills that you heard on the floor last week were all ALEC model bills. They all came directly out of ALEC. You also have whistleblower legislation. So legislation that essentially would limit agriculture products. And if you went into an agriculture product and blew the whistle on unsanitary conditions or how they were
Right.
treating animals, if you did that and ran an investigative story on that, you would actually get thrown in jail. Because in order to do that, you had to get the permission of the agriculture producer of this. And so
So
it's
I
creating
heard,
these type
yeah.
of laws that make it more difficult for us to hold these corporations
yeah, who wants to
accountable.
be embarrassed? I mean, if you're making DDT or bad products,
Well, and that's the problem, is that if there are problems, people should be held accountable to
Right,
them.
of
And
course,
instead of
yeah.
addressing these
I
issues,
jest,
the
yeah.
corporations are essentially trying to limit their liability, and that's a
Right.
huge problem. It's all about advancing the bottom lines of these corporations rather than the interests. And I think we really have to question who are legislators working for, these corporate special interests or us as constituents. And I think people need to ask those serious questions of their legislators.